record on this computer.
Hello, welcome guys to the second episode of the series that we're doing on the new UTOK book. So I'm doing this with my fiance. I have to restate that because that just makes me so happy. And on the first episode that we did on this, we went through the cover of the book, right? And all the symbolism that is in here. We introduced the context for the book. And on the second one, we're going to do an overview of the entirety of the book, right? Do you want to share some about what we're doing this time?
Absolutely. So, we'll get into a little bit of what's the core architecture of UTOK? That's spelled out a bit in the preface and sets us up for the chapters that will come. And so that way we kind of what are we heading into?
Right. So why don't we start on this starting point, right? What is UTOK's endeavor? What is its mission in the way that it's introduced in this book? Because this is the first time UTOK is introduced as a whole system, right? What is the mission?
Totally. So UTOK is this new approach to knowledge, unified theory of knowledge. And what it's doing is it's providing a new way to put together three broad, traditionally very different domains. One of the natural sciences, the objective knowledge that's gleaned from the natural sciences. What does that mean? That's what grounds out into physics versus the subjective phenomenological experiences of the human psyche. And then cultural knowledge. What does it mean to know things as a group in the United States? What does it mean to know things in China, in historical structures, the cultural collectives, in particular, the wisdom of cultural collectives. The argument fundamentally is that the objective picture of knowledge given by the natural sciences, the subjective experiences and perspective of the human psyche, and the cultural belief value systems that emerge in collectives, intersubjective collectives, are very different kinds of things, and we don't have ways to stitch them together. So the essence of UTOK is a new framework for putting those puzzle pieces together in a unified way.
Lovely. And I would say that historically and nowadays, there's fears, right? With that mindset that there is this problem of putting these different modes of thought together. One thing that I always go back to is how UTOK does that differently. Because it not only introduces the problematic, like there is a gap, we don't really know how to interrelate these different perspectives of seeing the world. But here's a solution also, right? Here's a way to actually bridge them and to explain how they're interrelated and how they can be both observed and lived in a way that's more consilient, in a way that's more holistic. So that would be an interesting thing to bring about too. How does UTOK do that in a different way than other thinkers and systems that have identified those gaps?
Right. So actually, you mentioned the word consilience. That's actually a good reference point to just locate where UTOK is and then specify what it is that makes it quite different. So consilience is a term that E.O. Wilson developed back in 1997. He wrote a book called Consilience, the Unity of Knowledge. And basically, he looked out at the landscape of knowledge and argued there are three great branches. There's the natural sciences, the social sciences, and the humanities. We can sort of collapse those into the natural sciences, sciences and humanities. And unity was this idea that you could somehow zoom back and frame the problem and see coherently jumping together of facts and theories that enabled us to see the whole and didn't have marked contradictions or a massive amount of diversity of opinion. And I want to flag that because there's an enormous amount of diversity, but usually we have a basic understanding, a basic grip on these issues. Actually, Stephen Jay Gould is sort of intellectual adversary, and he both agreed that the greatest enterprise of the mind was this attempted linkage, and consilience, the idea that you can have it unified. So that's where actually unified comes from, is essentially the same thing as consilience. There's a way to frame our knowledge problems, get a box on the frame of our knowledge problems in a way that allows coherence. So in that way, there's a lineage here with other scholars who are both recognizing the problem, which we formerly called the Enlightenment gap in this context of how do you put mind and matter together? How do you put various forms of knowledge together? That's the gap. Consilience is the idea you can, and then unified theory of knowledge, UTOK, diagnoses a particular problem and entry point, the problem of psychology, and that is missed by Wilson, and it provides a new set of frameworks for thinking about the sciences, the psyche, and the collective cultural knowledge, especially as we can extract wisdom from it. And it gives us the tree of knowledge for science, it gives us the coin for the psyche, and it gives us the garden for the intersubjective knowledge systems. And together, then, what we have in UTOK are three new frameworks to enter knowledge through the objective, subjective, intersubjective, and then these frameworks actually weave together, and that gives us consilience.
That's lovely. So like unification doesn't mean having a single system to explain everything, right? And then offering only this system as a way of thinking. I feel like people sometimes have that misconception, and that's something I've heard before. Either that, or like it's just integration, just eclecticism, just a jumping together of ideas that don't necessarily cohere. But by definition, unification or consilience means coherence too, right? It's having
exactly
not only the internal coherence, but also a coherence that corresponds to real truths scientifically in the world.
Totally. So one way to think about it then is what I'm proposing is a library system. If the academic knowledge system was arranged as sort of a library, right now it's unbelievably fragmented, chaotic, sort of put together by opinion. There's these broad clusters like there's physics and chemistry over here and biology, there's literature over here, etc. But in terms of what is human knowledge, and how do we actually box that in a way that coherently relates the valid aspects of them? And can we essentially zoom out and not fill in all the pieces by any stretch and not do so in a one universal voice, but basically what are the major pieces? How do they interrelate? And can that create a frame of understanding? UTOK says, yes, natural science can be boxed in over here. We've never figured out how to box that relative to the subjective experience of the human psyche. We never figured out how to yoke that to the collective sort of language, cultural knowledge systems that like a postmodern view would emphasize is where knowledge comes from. How do we yoke the cultural justification systems that exist in socio-historical contexts with the natural sciences that gives us things like, chemistry, and that's a particular kind of knowledge with when you wake up in the morning, you open your eyes, you see the world a particular way through your unique phenomenology. Those things are not put together in any way that affords a boxed-in, framed coherence. UTOK says, hey, we can do that now. We can take phenomenology, natural science, and cultural collective knowledge and have a framework that creates the music out of them rather than the current noise.
And what's really cool is that because of your background, right, in psychology and psychotherapy, you're able to see the problem of psychology, which is what allows UTOK to be this, you use this term in the preface, a cathedral for knowledge, right? It's this organized and structured. It doesn't have all the answers for everything, but as you learn things about the world, you're able to file them in, right? You have this shaping structure to give you a worldview, right? That is coherent and that can serve as a guiding structure depending on your values. And we'll be seeing that right throughout the chapters in this book as we get through these series.
Amen. Right. I basically argue that what happened, I backed into a place. It certainly wasn't a planned system, but as a clinical theoretical psychologist trained in behavioral science, it turns out there's a spot in our knowledge system where the subjective experience of being, the natural sciences from behavioral science, the social sciences and collective actually all come together in like clinical psychology in some ways. Because as a clinical psychologist, first off, I have the subject in front of me. I often would say, hey, you're the expert on you. What would I mean by that? Their unique, particular idiographic perspective. Hey, I should be grounded in some kind of science, like we're evolved primates, clearly. Oh, and hey, you live in a cultural collective, and I'm part of the cultural collective. I got values. So basically, I would argue that, hey, clinical psychology finds itself in this bind, and then it solves it by trying to solve the methods of problem. And I was like, well, wait, where's this coherence? And ultimately, I didn't initiate that structure of like saying, oh, this is missing and I need to find it. I sort of like, it sort of should be here. And then boom, had a couple of key insights and ultimately was on my way to UTOK.
Lovely. And then UTOK sort of fills this in with the three pillars, right, that are going to, I think in the next chapter or the one after that, we'll get to the three pillars, which are exactly the things that fill in those different epistemological vectors, right, of subjective and subjective. and not
Totally.
just
So this is I haven't, most of my work in the first two books was really focused on the problem of psychology and that there's a meta theory, a meta psychology that's available to us. The first one was on the unified theory of psychology academically. The second one then is in this sort of big picture UTOK as a meta psychology that ties together and allows us to see the whole anchored to philosophy. But really, UTOK fundamentally really starts with these three pillars: the tree of knowledge, the I-Quad coin, and the garden. As I mentioned last time, I didn't include those in the book, but now UTOK I'm just going to grab it and say, hey, these are these three vectors. It's the intersection of these three vectors. Those familiar with Ken Wilber, we should recognize some overlap with that, but it frames these three philosophical vectors. Then there's a theoretical richness to it, and that is where the UTOK metapsychology, which then gets organized by the tree of life, the unified theory of psychological science, and the unified approach to psychotherapy, four different ideas. That binds us to fill in the problem of psychology as it relates to psychotherapy. That's where the real gap is, at least as far as I'm concerned, that binds together the subjective, objective, intersubjective knowledge. And then ultimately, I fell into this and then saw sort of from the inside out a way to organize sort of archetypally knowledge. And the UTOK 20 is laid out and has all these different things like the wisdom bees in it and the dragon's lair and the stepping stone, and it has this sort of archetypal paradigmatic scientific weave. That's the UTOK 20. So this book enables me to lay out the three pillars in terms of the epistemological philosophical architecture, the UTOK metapsychology and sort of the 8 core ideas, the unified theory, unified approach, and zoom even back further, really be bridging archetypes, paradigms in science with the UTOK 20. And the argument is if you have access to all of those parts, then all of a sudden you can really see we've built a psychotechnology, use John Vervaeke's term, for a whole new way of organizing knowledge.
And it's a whole new language too, right? There's a play on words with UTOK, as in you talk, you use that in the preface, which I think is really cool because there is a lot of words that we already know, things like consciousness, cognition, mind, behavior, but that are reframed, right? And it's not just I think it should be defined this way, so I'm going to offer this new definition. No, it's based on a very refined analysis that is extensively laid out in the other books, right? But it's described and explained also in this one for why those terms should be redefined. So having in mind that UTOK solves the problem of psychology, that it identifies these knowledge gaps, what's the importance, what's the relevance of redefining these concepts in a way that creates a whole new language that needs a whole book to be explained.
That's lovely, right? So UTOK is, of course, that play on words, and as you helped me with the Now UTOK and Educational series, one of the first systematic things we pick out from UTOK has 15 different blog videos on how it defines terms, starting with behavior, into mind, into cognition, and consciousness, self. Those are some of the big 5 concepts that my field, psychology, our field, can't get a grip on. They can't define the way we can define an atom. The UTOK argues that's not because these are impossible to define, it's because we've got the wrong frame. And it's
why we've got so many questions, right? About
why we have so many questions.
What we are, what makes humans unique, what makes us different from other animals, right? These are all very central questions to understanding where we are at this point in the cosmos that are left unanswered because we don't know how to define those properly.
100%. And as you know, we just produced on a Psychology Today blog, because of the chapter you and I are working on, we're doing a project for people. We got feedback that, hey, can you tell us about why this looks like a new theory, the new stratification theory it's called, where you're stacking matter and life and mind and culture, classic tree of knowledge. And they're like, they tried this in the 20th century and it didn't work. Here's an article on the rise and fall of stratification theories in Germany. I've read similar things in Europe. So folks, if you're wondering, they try. It goes all the way back to Aristotle's scales in nature. Everywhere people see these 4 categories of matter, life, mind, and culture. The issue was that we couldn't figure out a way to put them together in a way that had the scientific integrity. I argue that actually these stratification theories were initially criticized by empiricists because they weren't precise. UTOK flips that around and says, actually now, with the way UTOK uses these things actually give us precise definitions of mind, of behavior, of self, of cognition, and then can get into things like personality, understand what the dispositions of Big 5 are, etc., and enable us to have a real coherent meta-theoretical network for psychology. And it turns out then that's going to actually bridge to science, the subject, and cultural collectives.
That's lovely. I think that draws back to your point in the beginning, right? UTOK is different from all these other attempts that are not only in the current context, the current meta-modern grammar, let's say UTOK is positioned in this meta-modern grammar, but I mean, that's a sensibility or a desire that many other thinkers throughout history have had, right? Of achieving a coherent picture of the world that sees all its different layers and levels in a coherent way. But this problem that UTOK identifies is, first of all, it happens during the Enlightenment, right? So people didn't have access to that before, obviously. And other systems have not detected that. They may have detected the repercussions of it, and then the other problems that come from this gap in knowledge, like the mind-body problem, but not a precise diagnosis of what happened, right, in the Enlightenment gap. And UTOK brings that, and because of that, it's able to provide this consilient picture.
Amen. We'll have a whole conversation devoted to the four problems. That's the enlightenment gap's the biggest one, relates to the mind-body problem. And then how do you ontologically define and matter versus mind, epistemologically relate scientific knowledge to subjective and social knowledge. Right next to that, or right downstream from that, is the problem of psychology. And that's where I'll stand up and say, hey, you think that quantum gravity is a hard problem, or relevant problem, or even the hard problem of consciousness? My work with John Vervaeke right now is really addressing that. But actually, I argue that at the epicenter of our knowledge, in terms of its gap, is the problem of psychology. It's the most obvious and downstream problem from the Enlightenment gap. And it's really about science, behavior, and mind. And that's what my 2002 book really basically says. This is a way we can't grip science, natural science, and how it relates to its concept of behavior, whatever that is, and relates to mind. And actually then we figured out how to do that with UTOK, and then bind those things together and then build a coherent, complexifying knowledge system from that. That then is framing our problems, not resolving them all, but we've missed a way to frame, get that, like mom taught you, hey, get the puzzle piece, you got a puzzle there, get the frames in there. We've been missing the frame, and UTOK's the frame on our way of thinking.
Perfect. Yeah, that's exciting. I'm looking forward to what's coming next, in the next episodes for us to dig into all these ideas. So why don't we take a look at the trajectory of the book, where it starts, where it goes through, where it ends, and maybe you can share a little about the process of writing that, right, and why it's organized in the way that it is.
Sure. Yeah. My goal, I kind of set myself a goal that said, okay, here's a certain amount of word length. I want this book. If you're a pretty fluid reader, you could get through it in like 4 hours. That was sort of my goal. Like, okay, you really sit down, you can read it pretty quick. And then I wanted to chunk it so that it'd be like, all right, my goal is just to describe the puzzle pieces and then network them together so that somebody could sit down in 4 hours and at least see what this is. So I'm not engaged in rich, elaborate defenses, counter arguments, etc. It's like, boom, here's this puzzle piece, here's the next. And it starts just with the context that we find ourselves in. And the context is hey, what is our current state of knowledge? What's the current state of society? And basically it says, it is the case, I believe, that anybody that's philosophically reflective can look and say, hey, natural science gives us one view of understanding the world. The subjective experience of being is another. Philosophers have said this. Ken Wilber says this pretty well. Donald Davidson, I open the quote with, hey, we have this problem. How do we know about it? Well, I mean, how can we frame it? And UTOK immediately has this novel way of approaching the frame and says that opens up a possibility. And then it also says, where are we in the 21st century? Right. What's happening?
The meta crisis, right?
The meta crises that we basically are. Where are our knowledge system? Why is our knowledge system seeming to be so increasingly fragmented? What's desperate? And I argue that actually UTOK has a system to come in and make this fifth joint point, for example, is actually this really interesting way, and we get into talking about that. And the basic argument that we have these core four problems. So the context is, hey, there's these different domains of philosophy that are not related. Our knowledge systems are really fragmented. And when we look at why they're fragmented, we get the four problems of the Enlightenment gap: problem of psychology, problem of psychotherapy, and psyche. Those are the four. So that's our context, is we're in a chaotic, fragmented state of knowledge, and it's relevant for how society seems to be evolving, whether meaning crisis, technological, environmental kind of crisis, things along those lines. So that's the first structure. And then if that is the structure, is there a way to interrelate these three different domains of knowing? So part two of the book, after we have the context, then lays out the three philosophical pillars. It devotes a chapter to each one: the tree of knowledge, the iQuad coin, and the garden. And then it tells a little bit of the fourth chapter in that section tells the story about how UTOK came about. So then that's the zoom out, and that's say, here's how we're going to frame this: one pathway, another pathway, another pathway, and a history. That gives us the contextual framing. And then from there, it basically jumps into my second book and lays out what we call the descriptive metaphysics. Okay, metaphysics, a term I didn't know too much about. I would have sneered at as a scientist. I didn't realize that actually it's the concepts and categories in general. It asks profound questions in pure philosophy, but descriptive metaphysics is the bridge from philosophy into science in particular, I would say, meaning that you're going to anchor yourself into an empiricism. And so a classic descriptive metaphysics problem is, what is behavior? What is mind? What is science? How do they relate? Those are the concepts and categories. And UTOK comes with a powerful descriptive metaphysics. Obviously, the tree of knowledge is kind of that, the iQuad coin. Newer in the last couple of years is the periodic table of behavior and map of mind. Together, these provide us the language to talk about the psyche, mind, behavior, and science. And these are the descriptive metaphysics that are going to enable us to map what's going on.
That's a very important section of the book, right? Because that's what sets the stage for the new vocabulary that UTOK brings. How should we define behavior, mind? We don't get too much into consciousness in this book, but it definitely frames the general definitions that we want to have in mind to begin to understand.
Totally. And one of them is devoted to this whole concept of mindedness. Baron Short and I are doing in parallel with this, started this a little while ago, this mindedness revolution, a totally new way to grip mind, behavior, and consciousness in this concept. So that's a missing metaphysical descriptor. We have a chapter on that. So yes, I think I realize that zooming out, the concepts and categories of my field, psychology is a soft science because it doesn't grip them. UTOK actually grips them with the kind of precision that we can grip things like cells and atoms. And that's pretty remarkable because now all of a sudden we can actually, by gripping the concepts and categories, seeing their interrelation, I think we'll be able to achieve a lot more cumulative knowledge coming off them.
Lovely. So. It's very funny that like in mainstream academic psychology, you're sort of taught to steer away from metaphysics, or implicitly, I guess that's an implicit thing in the field, but that's precisely what it needs, right?
That's right. As long as you maintain, and we write about this, as long as you maintain a connection to the empirical world, both your first-person observation and third-person systematic data, and this is right at the center of the tree of life. If we were to hold up, when we hold up our thing, what's this little flower in the middle? It's that metaphysical, empirical, dialectical flower. That means, hey, what are your concepts and categories, and what are the data and how you're organizing that? I realized that we didn't have the right frame for concepts and categories. So that descriptive metaphysics is crucial. And then from there, it then gives really the heart of my initial development, which is on the unified theory of psychology, and how I saw what was unique about humans in terms of the problem and justification, the evolution of the ego and the persona and the culture-person plane of existence back in 1996. And that then set the stage for me to then see the tree of knowledge as the stratified layers of different information processing, communication networks of life, mind, and culture coming off of matter, ultimately coming off of energy. And that gave me the stratification. And boom, with that, I had the boxing, stratified complexification boxing necessary to assimilate and integrate, add the behavioral investment theory as the joint point from life to mind, the influence matrix as the evolution of sort of social relations, and that's particularly relevant for us as primates, justification as person, and boom, you get the four key ideas that make up the unified theory. So that's the next unified theory of psychology. The next section that concludes with how we apply that and things like talk about how humans, we can update our folk psychology with justification, investment, and influence. And so that's then really the first core chunk of the meta theory, meta theoretical architecture. And then it bridges to my profession and your profession in terms of it being, how do we talk with people in a way that helps them deal with their psychological problems? That's the unified approach. Of course, you and I have done some fun work together in delineating the common core that's actually been evolving ever since, but a way to frame the common core. But then you get the unified approach to psychotherapy, which, as you and I know, there's a lot of general stuff that's happening rather before these specific schools emerge, and we need to account for them. The unified theory does that, provides a framework for thinking about that, some tools of the unified approach. So that's the next section. And that's the core meta psychology of the structure. And that fills in the next section. And then the next two sections, the next section after that, then gets into this whole UTOK 20 world. And people that see the garden and what's actually on top of here, and this thing called the stepping stone. What is that? Well, actually, it connects right into modern physics in a particular way. And the dragon's lair, this personality disorder, Star lives over the dragon's lair, things along those lines, these wisdom bees, the elephant sun god. This archetypal, paradigmatic bridge from then these scientific concepts into this knowledge vision system, which I believe the 21st century will sort of reveal to be the new phase in knowledge, bridging visual archetypes, paradigms, and science together. It's trying to do that in a particular way. So then that lays out the garden portion, extends that into the whole kind of UTOK 20.
So it goes from these explanations about psychology into the application of it in psychotherapy or other applied endeavors, and then into the value orientation of the garden, right? With all these different elements that talk about values, and then also mental health problems that we can get into, and what we do about that in a collective.
Totally. And I'm glad you mentioned that, because really the seed of the value is found in the seed. And I didn't even reference the seed. It's got three different core little ideas, including like the wisdom energy icon, which specifies the work that UTOK does in sort of elucidating cultural values. And the wisdom bees speak to that as well. So yes, we have facts and then subjective experience of being in relation and psychology. And then it's like, well, wait a minute. What about aesthetics and axiology and ultimately theology and speculations about how we ought to live? Well, the garden is where we're not only going to be clarifying what is through science and subjectivity, but we are then intersubjectively cultivating what ought to be. Well, how do you fuse those things together? That's the nature of intersubjective collective knowledge. How can we frame this? Well, my first key insight, justification systems theory, actually shows how networks of propositions between people get yoked together, and they actually are binding fact and value together in a particular way, even while they also potentially afford clarity about how they can be differentiated.
Lovely. And then the last section is where you get to the fifth joint point, right? And where we're headed in this next phase.
Totally. So one of the things that freaked me out about the specificity of this, at this time, the tree of knowledge, back in the or right before 20th turn of 20th century, the 21st century, was once I drew out the idea that life, mind, and culture were these three different cones, which then really were, these are networks of information processing communication that give rise to different behavioral complexification patterns. So I'll say that again, some new kind of emerging information processing system that then communicates with other information processing systems. Cells do that, and they communicate together. Then there's nervous systems, and they organize animals, and then animals communicate. And then there's propositional language, and that connects us together, like we're doing right now. And then what happens to technology is actually artificial intelligence. Computers, the internet now, LLMs and everything else, Zoom calls, etc. And what's happening here is a whole new information processing communication network that's going to open up a whole new, potentially complex active plane of existence. Now, what's interesting, adaptive plane of existence. So what does that mean? When I look out at the landscape, it means we're right at this transition point between the culture-person plane into this global, digital global system. And that's fraught with all sorts of huge amounts of potential and a lot of danger. So that's kind of the situation we're in that allows us to identify as in the fifth joint point. In fact, that's our UTOK newsletter. And then the question is, well, how do we frame knowledge in relationship to that? And so once we frame the fifth joint point, then how do we organize our knowledge? What are the values? I talk about my work with John Vervaeke and transcendent naturalism, a transjective kind of knowing that would transcend the intersubjective, subjective, and objective, and think fundamentally about, well, how do we really abstract the long-standing patterns of orienting toward wisdom, and how do we ingrain those as valued states of being? And ultimately, that's where the book is going to conclude, is sort of like, how do we collectively think seriously about how to be good ancestors and organize ourselves to be oriented in a healthy, well-being, wise way to the back half of the 21st century.
Lovely. And arguably, we can only do that collectively if we have this clarity, right, about where we are in the cosmos, who we are as primates and persons, and how we can think about values collectively. And it's incredible that this all fits in the short book. It is a short book, right? So that's incredible to me. There's so much packed in here. And we'll uncover all that in the next episodes.
All right. Thank you so much. It's a joy to do the journey with you. It's been a joy. And that's why I dedicated the book to you, my fiance.
Yes.
And thank you so much for hosting us through episode 2.
Thank you for doing this with me.
Bye.